The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek as Theresa Bennett fought back tears, the sting of her husband's palm still burning across her cheek. It was 1878, and like the frontier town itself, Theresa's life had become a harsh, unforgiving place where dreams came to wither and die. "You worthless woman!" Edgar Bennett's voice boomed across the street, drawing the unwanted attention of passers-by who quickly averted their eyes. No one interfered when a man disciplined his wife, even in public. "Can't even remember to pick up my tobacco without making a fool of yourself." Theresa kept her eyes downcast, clutching her market basket tighter as the humiliation burned hotter than the slap. At 23, the pretty young woman with copper hair had already endured 5 years of Edgar's increasing cruelty, watching as the charming man she'd married transformed into a monster fueled by whiskey and bitterness. "I'm sorry, Edgar," she whispered, tasting blood where her lip had split. Mr. Johnson was out of your preferred, his hand raised again, and Theresa flinched, bracing for another blow. "That's enough." The voice was deep, calm, and carried the unmistakable weight of authority. Edgar's hand froze mid-air as both he and Theresa turned toward the source. Garrett Finley stood tall beside his chestnut mare, one hand resting casually on his holstered Colt. At 30, the cowboy's face told stories of sun and wind, his eyes the clear blue of a mountain lake. Though he'd only been in Willow Creek for 3 weeks, working at the Carson Ranch outside town, his reputation for fairness and quiet strength had already spread. "This ain't your concern, cowboy," Edgar spat, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "A man's got the right to handle his wife as he sees fit." Garrett's expression remained impassive, but his eyes hardened. "Not like this, not in my sight." He moved with deliberate slowness, placing himself between Edgar and Theresa. "The lady looks like she could use a moment's peace." Edgar's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt, but Garrett's steady gaze made him reconsider. The cowboy hadn't drawn his weapon, but the threat was implicit. "You'll regret this," Edgar hissed, jabbing a finger in Garrett's direction. His eyes shifted to Theresa. "And you best be home before dark with supper ready, or there'll be hell to pay." As Edgar stormed off toward the saloon, Theresa released a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping in momentary relief. Then panic set in as she realized what had just happened. "You shouldn't have done that, sir," she whispered, glancing nervously in the direction her husband had gone. "He'll only be worse later." Garrett turned to her, taking in her trembling form, the reddened cheek, and the quiet dignity with which she held herself despite it all. Something inside him shifted, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. "Madam," he said softly, removing his hat in respect, "no one deserves to be treated that way." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "If you'll permit me, I'd like to help you with your packages and see you safely wherever you need to go." Theresa stared at his outstretched hand, a lifeline in a drowning world. Everything she had been taught told her to refuse, to hurry home and attempt to placate Edgar's inevitable rage. Yet something in Garrett's eyes, kindness without pity, strength without threat, made her reach out and place her fingers in his. "Thank you, Mr. Finley, Garrett Finley." His calloused hand closed gently around hers. "And I promise you this, Mrs. Bennett. You won't suffer pain like that again, not if I have anything to say about it." The promise hung in the air between them, impossible yet utterly sincere. Theresa knew she should pull her hand away, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear, a dangerous flutter of hope. Neither could have known that this moment, on a dusty street as the sun painted the sky crimson, would change both their lives forever. "I should go," Theresa said, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. "I need to get home before." She didn't finish the sentence, but Garrett understood. "At least let me carry those for you." He nodded toward her market basket and the packages balanced precariously atop it. Propriety demanded she refuse, but practicality won out. "That would be kind, Mr. Finley." She surrendered the basket, careful not to let their fingers brush again. They walked in silence along the boardwalk, Theresa acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. Willow Creek wasn't large, and gossip traveled faster than telegrams. By nightfall, everyone would know about the confrontation. "You're new to town," she finally said, keeping her eyes forward. "Working at Carson's place, aren't you?" Garrett nodded. "Hired on last month. Mr. Carson's expanding his herd, needs extra hands." He matched his pace to her shorter strides. "I've been drifting since the war ended. Thought it might be time to put down roots somewhere." "The war?" Theresa glanced up at him with new interest. "You fought Union cavalry." His expression turned distant. "Seems a lifetime ago now." Theresa nodded, understanding there were wounds that didn't show on the skin. Edgar had been too young for the conflict, something he seemed to resent, as though it diminished his standing among men. They turned onto Maple Street, where the modest homes of tradesmen and shop clerks lined the road. Theresa slowed her steps as they approached a small white house with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. "This is it," she said quietly. Garrett surveyed the neglected property with a critical eye. The fence needed mending, the roof showed signs of leakage, and the garden had gone to weeds. This wasn't just poverty, this was neglect. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Finley." Theresa reached for her basket. I should hurry now." Instead of immediately handing over her things, Garrett hesitated. "Mrs. Bennett," he began, then faltered, uncharacteristically uncertain. "If you ever need help, any kind of help, I'm usually at Carson's ranch. Or you can leave word at the general store with Mrs. Peterson. She knows how to reach me." Theresa's eyes widened at his boldness, but she couldn't find it in herself to be properly scandalized. Instead, gratitude washed over her. "That's very kind," she managed. "But your husband shouldn't be striking you," Garrett said firmly. "Not in public, not in private, not ever." The simple truth of his words brought unexpected tears to Theresa's eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "The world doesn't work that way, Mr. Finley," she whispered. "Especially not for women." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Maybe it should." He handed over her basket and packages, tipped his hat, and stepped back. "Good day, Mrs. Bennett." He turned to leave, then paused. "I meant what I said, about the pain." Theresa watched him walk away, his broad shoulders straight, his stride purposeful. Only when he was out of sight did she allow herself to touch her bruised cheek, replaying his unexpected kindness in her mind. Then reality reasserted itself. She hurried inside to prepare Edgar's supper, knowing that whatever repercussions awaited her, she would face them alone. Garrett Finley's promise, while well-intentioned, was just that, a promise. Words in the wind, unable to change the harsh realities of her life. Or so she believed. Edgar didn't return home that night. Theresa sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, supper congealing on the plate, jumping at every sound outside. When she finally retired to their bed, sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to the cowboy with the steady eyes and impossible promise. Dawn was breaking when the pounding on the front door began. Theresa jerked awake, heart racing. Edgar wouldn't knock, this was someone else. Fear coiled in her stomach as she hastily donned a wrapper over her nightdress and hurried to answer. Sheriff Davis stood on her porch, hat in hand, his weathered face grim. Behind him, Dr. Matthews shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. "Mrs. Bennett," the sheriff began, then cleared his throat. "I'm afraid I have difficult news." The world seemed to slow as the sheriff explained. Edgar had gotten into a card game at the Red Dog Saloon, accused another player of cheating, pulled his knife. The other man had pulled a gun. Edgar Bennett was dead. Theresa stood very still, waiting for grief that didn't come. Instead, she felt numb, hollow, and beneath that, something she dared not acknowledge: relief. "We'll need you to come identify the body, madam," Sheriff Davis said gently. "When you're ready." Theresa nodded mechanically. "I'll dress and come right away." After they left, she sank into a kitchen chair, hands pressed against her mouth to hold back the strange, hysterical laughter that threatened to escape. Edgar was gone. The realization hit her in waves: no more bruises to hide, no more walking on eggshells, no more lying awake wondering what might set him off. She was free. And she was terrified. Without Edgar's income from the freight office, how would she manage? The house was rented, their savings non-existent thanks to Edgar's gambling. As a widow at 23, her options were few in a frontier town like Willow Creek. Still, as she dressed in her best black dress, salvaged from her mother's funeral 3 years prior, Theresa couldn't suppress the tiny spark of hope that had kindled in her chest. Whatever hardships lay ahead, they were hers to face on her own terms. As she pinned up her copper hair and covered it with a black bonnet, Theresa caught her reflection in the small mirror. The bruise on her cheek was darkening to purple, a final reminder of Edgar's legacy. She touched it gently, remembering Garrett Finley's words. "You won't suffer pain like that again." Perhaps, in his own way, he had kept his promise after all. The following weeks passed in a blur for Theresa. Identifying Edgar's body at the undertaker's, the sparse funeral attended only by a few of Edgar's drinking companions and some curious townsfolk. Moving out of the rented house into a tiny room above the millinery shop, where Mrs. Abernathy had kindly offered her work. Word of her circumstances had spread through town, and while some looked at her with pity, others viewed the young widow with suspicion. Rumors circulated that she hadn't seemed properly grief-stricken, that she and the cowboy who'd interfered might have planned it somehow. Theresa ignored the whispers as best she could, focusing instead on learning the millinery trade. Her fingers were nimble, and she had an eye for color and design that Mrs. Abernathy praised. For the first time, Theresa was earning her own way, making her own decisions. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. She hadn't seen Garrett Finley since that fateful day. She'd heard he still worked at Carson's ranch, but their paths hadn't crossed. Sometimes she wondered if he'd heard about Edgar's death, what he might think of it. She told herself it didn't matter. Until one rainy Tuesday in April, nearly a month after Edgar's death, when the bell above the shop door jingled and Garrett Finley himself stepped inside, removing his hat and shaking rainwater from the brim. Theresa froze, a length of blue ribbon dangling from her fingers. They stared at each other across the empty shop, the only sound the drumming of rain on the roof and the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Mrs. Bennett," Garrett said finally, his voice low. "Mr. Finley." She managed a small nod, suddenly conscious of her work apron and the pins stuck in her sleeve. He approached the counter slowly, as if giving her time to retreat if she wished. "I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for your loss." The formal condolence sounded strange between them, given the circumstances of their last meeting. Theresa inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said, the expected response coming automatically. Then, because honesty compelled her, she added quietly, "Though perhaps it's not the tragedy some might think." Garrett's eyes flickered to her cheek where the bruise had finally faded. "No," he agreed softly. "Perhaps not." A silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable. "Are you here for a hat, Mr. Finley?" Theresa finally asked, attempting a professional tone. Or perhaps a gift for a lady friend, the corner of his mouth twitched. Do I look like a man who wears fancy hats, Mrs. Bennett? Despite herself, Theresa smiled. I suppose not. She set down the ribbon. Then what brings you to a millinery shop on such a disagreeable day? Garrett seemed to be considering his words carefully. I wanted to see how you were faring, he admitted finally, to offer any assistance you might need. The simple kindness in his voice threatened to undo her carefully maintained composure. Theresa busied herself rearranging hat stands to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes. That's very kind, but I'm managing quite well, she said, her back to him. Mrs. Abernathy has been most generous with employment and accommodations. I'm glad to hear it. He paused. Carson sent me to town for supplies. I'll be heading back to the ranch shortly, but perhaps you might consider taking Sunday dinner at Carson's place. Mrs. Carson specifically asked me to extend the invitation. Theresa turned, surprised. She knew of the Carsons. Of course, James Carson was one of the largest ranchers in the territory, and his wife Emily was known for her charitable works, but they moved in different circles than a milliner's assistant. That's unexpected, she said cautiously. Garrett shifted his weight, suddenly seeming less sure of himself. Mrs. Carson heard about your situation. She has a soft spot for those making their own way. He hesitated. And I may have mentioned meeting you after. What happened? Realization dawned. You told them about Edgar striking me, about intervening. I did. He met her gaze steadily. I don't apologize for it. The Carsons are good people. They don't hold with men who abuse their wives. Theresa felt her cheeks warm. Part of her wanted to be indignant that her private humiliation had been discussed, but another part recognized the genuine concern behind the gesture. Sunday dinner, she repeated thoughtfully. I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, Mrs. Carson makes enough food to feed an army, and she enjoys company. He smiled slightly. She says I'm too quiet and the other hand's too rough-mannered for proper conversation. Theresa found herself returning his smile. And am I to provide this proper conversation? I reckon you do a sight better than most of us. His expression turned serious again. You don't have to accept, of course, but the invitation is sincere. Theresa considered. She hadn't left town since Edgar's death, hadn't socialized at all beyond her necessary interactions at the shop. The prospect of an afternoon away was tempting. Very well, she decided. Please thank Mrs. Carson and tell her I would be delighted to accept. Garrett's smile broadened, transforming his weathered face. I'll come fetch you around noon on Sunday if that suits. That would be fine. Theresa hesitated, then added, Thank you, Mr. Finley, for checking on my welfare. He placed his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly. Just keeping a promise, Mrs. Bennett. As he left, the bell jingling behind him, Theresa realized her heart was beating faster than usual. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm it. This was merely a kind gesture from the Carsons, nothing more. She was a recent widow, still in mourning by society's standards, and Garrett Finley was simply being neighborly. Yet as she returned to her ribbons and feathers, Theresa couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted, like the first trembling leaf that signals the turning of seasons. Sunday dawned clear and mild, the recent rains having coaxed an explosion of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Willow Creek. Theresa spent longer than necessary selecting her attire, a modest navy dress with white collar and cuffs, proper for a widow but not severely funereal. She pinned her hair in a simple chignon, adding a small navy hat of her own design. At precisely noon, Garrett arrived with a buggy rather than horseback, another courtesy that didn't escape Theresa's notice. He was freshly shaved, his usual work clothes replaced by clean dark trousers and a pressed white shirt. He removed his hat when she emerged from the millinery's side entrance, and something in his expression as he looked at her made Theresa's cheeks warm. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted her formally, extending a hand to help her into the buggy. "You look lovely today." "Thank you, Mr. Finley." She settled her skirts around her, acutely aware of his presence as he climbed up beside her. "It's kind of you to provide transportation. Wouldn't expect a lady to ride all that way on horseback." He clicked to the horse, and they set off through town. It's about 5 miles to Carson's place. Theresa was conscious of curious eyes watching them pass. A young widow out with a single man would certainly fuel gossip, even with the respectable destination of the Carson ranch. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she cared less about this than she might have expected. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up around them. Rolling hills covered in spring grass stretched to the horizon, dotted with cattle and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. Theresa breathed deeply, realizing how confined she'd felt within Willow Creek's narrow streets. "It's beautiful out here," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Garrett nodded, his eyes on the road. "That's what drew me to ranching work, space to breathe." "Have you always been a cowboy?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who had altered the course of her life with one intervention. He shook his head. "Grew up in Pennsylvania. My father was a blacksmith. I was apprenticed to him before the war." His voice took on that distant quality it had when he'd mentioned his service before. "Afterwards, couldn't settle back into that life. Too many memories, too many ghosts." Theresa studied his profile, strong and weathered. "So you came west." "Like many others," he agreed. "Drifted for a while. Worked cattle drives, ranch work, whatever honest labor I could find." He glanced at her. "What about you? Have you always lived in Willow Creek?" Theresa shook her head. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father was a clerk for a shipping company." She looked out at the passing landscape. "When he died, my mother and I struggled. Edgar was a friend of my father's colleague. He seemed kind, stable, when he proposed and spoke of opportunities in the West." She trailed off, then added quietly, "He wasn't always as he was at the end." Garrett's hands tightened on the reins. "Men like that rarely show their true nature until they have control." "Yes," Theresa said softly. "I learned that lesson too late." They were quiet for a moment, then Garrett asked, "Do you miss the city?" Theresa considered this. "Sometimes. The theaters, the shops. But there's something about the openness here that speaks to me." She smiled slightly. "Though I do miss having regular access to new books. The selection at Willow Creek's general store leaves much to be desired." "Mrs. Carson has quite a library," Garrett told her. "She's always offering books to the hands, though most haven't taken her up on it. I've borrowed a few." Theresa looked at him with new interest. "You enjoy reading?" He nodded. "When there's time. Winter evenings especially." "What do you read?" "History mostly. Some poetry." He looked almost embarrassed at the admission. "Tennyson, Wordsworth." "A cowboy who reads poetry," Theresa mused. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Finley." He glanced at her, a smile playing at his lips. "So I've been told." The Carson ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and even from a distance, the property had an air of prosperity and care. As they approached, a woman emerged onto the wide front porch. Emily Carson was in her 40s, handsome rather than pretty, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She waved enthusiastically as Garrett drove the buggy up to the house. "You must be Mrs. Bennett," she called as Garrett helped Theresa down. "I'm so pleased you could join us today." Theresa was enveloped in a warm embrace before she could respond, Mrs. Carson's genuine welcome dispelling any lingering nervousness. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Carson," Theresa said once she was released. "It's very kind of you." "Nonsense, dear, and please call me Emily. We don't stand on ceremony out here." She linked her arm through Theresa's. "Garrett James is in the barn with that new stallion. He'd appreciate your opinion." Garrett nodded, tipping his hat to Theresa. "If you'll excuse me, ladies." As he walked toward the barn, Emily Carson steered Theresa toward the house. "Now, you must tell me all about yourself. Garrett mentioned you're working with Alice Abernathy at the millinery. I've always said she has the best taste in hats this side of Denver." Theresa found herself drawn into easy conversation as Emily showed her around the comfortable home. The Carson Ranch house was a revelation, spacious yet cozy, with polished wood floors covered by colorful rugs, walls lined with bookshelves, and windows that captured views of the surrounding countryside. "It's lovely," Theresa said sincerely as they settled in the parlor with tea. "So different from town. I couldn't bear to be hemmed in by neighbors," Emily confided. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio, need my space." She studied Theresa over her teacup. "How are you finding life in Willow Creek, truly?" Something in the older woman's direct gaze encouraged honesty. "It's an adjustment," Theresa admitted. "Learning to be on my own again." Emily nodded. "Garrett told us a little of your circumstances. I hope you don't mind." "No," Theresa said after a moment's consideration, "though I'm sure some in town think I should be more grieved by Edgar's passing." "People will always talk," Emily said dismissively. "What matters is that you're safe now and finding your way forward." She set down her cup. "Alice tells me you have quite a talent for millinery work." "She's been very encouraging," Theresa acknowledged. "I enjoy it more than I expected to." "Good. A woman should have work that satisfies her." Emily leaned forward. "But I wonder if you've considered other possibilities. 5 miles isn't so far from town, and we could use help here at the ranch." Theresa blinked in surprise. "I'm not sure what help I could offer on a cattle ranch, Mrs. Carson." "Emily, please." She waved a hand. "Not with the cattle, dear. With the house, the gardens, the accounts. James is expanding the operation, and I find myself overwhelmed at times. I've been thinking of hiring a companion who could assist with correspondence, household management, and such." "You're offering me employment?" Theresa asked, trying to process this unexpected turn. "I'm suggesting the possibility," Emily corrected gently. "You would have your own room in the house, meals provided, and a fair wage. More independence than town might offer a young widow." She smiled knowingly. "And fewer wagging tongues." Before Theresa could formulate a response, the front door opened, and male voices filled the hallway. James Carson entered first, tall and broad-shouldered with a salt and pepper beard, followed by Garrett. "So this is our guest." Carson boomed jovially, crossing to take Theresa's hand. "Welcome to Circle C, Mrs. Bennett. I trust my wife hasn't talked your ear off yet, James," Emily scolded, but her eyes were fond. "I was just telling Theresa about our need for household help." James Carson's eyebrows rose. "Ah, straight to business then. You'll have to forgive my wife, Mrs. Bennett. When she gets an idea in her head, she doesn't waste time." "It's a quality you claimed to admire when you married me," Emily retorted with good humor. Theresa glanced at Garrett, who was watching the exchange with the relaxed familiarity of someone accustomed to the Carsons' banter. When he caught her looking, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm flattered by the offer," Theresa said carefully, "but it's quite unexpected. I would need time to consider." "Of course," Emily agreed readily. "No need to decide today. Now let's move to the dining room. Cook has prepared a feast, and I won't have it getting cold while we chatter." The dinner that followed was unlike any Theresa had experienced since coming west. The food was plentiful and delicious: roast beef, fresh vegetables from Emily's kitchen garden, warm bread with fresh churned butter, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with James Carson regaling them with tales of the early days of the ranch, Emily adding her perspective, and even Garrett contributing occasional dry observations that revealed a sharp wit beneath his quiet demeanor. Not once did anyone treat Theresa with the awkward pity she'd grown accustomed to in town. Here, miles from Willow Creek, she was simply a young woman with a future ahead of her, not Edgar Bennett's widow with a questionable lack of grief. After dinner, Emily insisted on showing Theresa her garden, leaving the men to their coffee. "I meant what I said about the position," Emily said as they walked between neat rows of vegetables and herbs, "but I understand your hesitation." Theresa bent to admire a cluster of spring wildflowers Emily had transplanted from the prairie. "It's a generous offer. I'm just not sure leaving town is the right decision. I've only just begun to establish myself there." Emily studied her thoughtfully. "May I speak plainly?" Theresa nodded, straightening. "Small towns have long memories and narrow minds," Emily said. "Your husband's death, the circumstances preceding it, these things will follow you in Willow Creek for years to come. Here you would have a fresh start." She paused. "And I believe certain company you might find more agreeable than the gossips of Main Street." Theresa felt her cheeks warm at the implied reference to Garrett. "Mrs. Carson, Emily." "Emily," Theresa conceded, "if you're suggesting that Mr. Finley and I—" Emily laughed softly. "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort. Merely observing that Garrett Finley is a good man who seems to hold you in high regard. Whether that develops into something more would be entirely between the two of you." Her expression sobered. "He's carried his own burden since the war. It does my heart good to see him taking an interest in something beyond work and books." Theresa didn't know how to respond to this frank assessment. Instead, she changed the subject slightly. "What exactly would my duties entail if I were to accept?" Emily allowed the redirection, outlining responsibilities that would include managing household accounts, organizing supplies, assisting with correspondence, and overseeing the vegetable garden. The position sounded challenging but not overwhelming, with fair compensation, and the freedom Theresa had only just begun to taste. By the time they returned to the house, where Garrett and James were discussing breeding plans for the cattle herd, Theresa had promised to give the offer serious consideration. The afternoon light was beginning to soften when Garrett announced it was time to return to town. Theresa was surprised by her reluctance to leave the Carson ranch and its hospitable atmosphere. "Think about our offer," Emily said, embracing her warmly at parting. "No rush to decide, but know you'd be welcome here." James shook her hand firmly. "Indeed. We could use a sensible young woman's perspective around here. Too many rough men with mud on their boots." As Garrett helped her into the buggy again, Theresa felt a curious lightness. Options were opening before her, real choices about her future, something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage. They drove in companionable silence for a while, the shadows lengthening across the prairie. Finally, Garrett spoke. "The Carsons took a shine to you." Theresa smiled. "They're very kind people. I'm grateful for their hospitality." "Are you considering their offer?" His tone was carefully neutral. Theresa gazed at the landscape passing by. "I'm giving it serious thought. It seems a good opportunity." Garrett nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "It would be. The Carsons treat their people well." After a pause, he added, "I'd be glad to see you take it." Theresa looked at him, studying his profile in the golden evening light. "Would you?" His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the road. "Yes, madam, I would." The simple honesty in his voice made something flutter in Theresa's chest. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a silence filled with unspoken possibilities. As Willow Creek came into view, Theresa felt as if she were seeing it differently, not as her prison, but as a place she might choose to leave on her own terms. "Thank you for today, Mr. Finley," she said as he helped her down in front of the millinery. "I enjoyed it very much." His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "As did I, Mrs. Bennett." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever you decide about the Carsons' offer, I hope we might continue our acquaintance." Theresa found herself smiling up at him. "I would like that." As she watched him drive away, Theresa realized that for the first time since Edgar's death, perhaps for the first time since her marriage, she was looking forward to what tomorrow might bring. 3 days later, Theresa informed Mrs. Abernathy of her decision to accept the Carsons' offer. The older woman was disappointed to lose her assistant, but understood the opportunity it represented. "You've a good head on your shoulders, Theresa," she said, patting her hand. "And it's high time you had some space from the nattering busybodies in this town." Preparations for the move were simple. Theresa had few possessions: her clothes, a locket containing a miniature portrait of her parents, a worn copy of Tennyson's poems that had been her father's, and the small collection of millinery skills she'd acquired under Mrs. Abernathy's tutelage. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Some wished her well. Others whispered behind their hands about the impropriety of a young widow moving to a ranch where single men were employed. Theresa found she cared less about their opinions with each passing day. Garrett came to collect her on a sunny Saturday morning, driving the same buggy they'd used for the Sunday visit. Mrs. Abernathy tearfully embraced Theresa, extracting promises of visits, while a small crowd of curious onlookers gathered to witness her departure. "Ready?" Garrett asked quietly as he loaded her trunk into the buggy. Theresa took one last look at the millinery shop, at the dusty main street of Willow Creek with its false-fronted buildings and narrow horizons. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm ready." The journey to the ranch seemed shorter this time, filled with Garrett's explanations of ranch operations and Theresa's questions about her new role. The easy conversation between them felt natural, as if they'd known each other far longer than the few weeks of their acquaintance. Emily Carson welcomed Theresa like a long-lost daughter, showing her to a bright corner bedroom with windows overlooking the garden. The room was simply but comfortably furnished, with a chest of drawers, a small writing desk, a rocking chair, and a bed covered with a colorful quilt. "I hope you'll be happy here," Emily said, squeezing Theresa's hand before leaving her to settle in. Looking around the sunny room that was now hers alone, Theresa felt a sense of rightness, of having taken a step toward a future of her own choosing rather than one dictated by circumstances or the expectations of others. The transition to ranch life proved smoother than Theresa had anticipated. Emily was a patient teacher, showing her the household systems and gradually entrusting her with more responsibility. Theresa found satisfaction in organizing the pantry, planning menus with cook, managing the household accounts, and helping tend the garden. Her interactions with the ranch hands were limited and proper, always under the watchful eye of either Emily or James. The men were respectful, if sometimes awkward in her presence. All except Garrett, who maintained a friendly but careful distance. Their conversations limited to necessary business or polite exchanges at mealtimes. June arrived with long, warm days and spectacular sunsets that painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Theresa often sat on the back porch in the evenings, watching the changing colors and listening to the chorus of night creatures beginning their songs. It was during one such evening that Garrett found her, a book in his hand. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I thought you might enjoy this. Mrs. Carson mentioned you were asking about it." He held out a copy of Wuthering Heights. Theresa took it with delight. "I've wanted to read this for ages." "Thank you." He nodded, replacing his hat and turning to go. "Mr. Finley," she called after him, making a sudden decision. "Would you care to sit for a while? The sunset is particularly beautiful tonight." He hesitated, then returned to settle carefully on the opposite end of the porch bench. "It is at that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in brilliant hues. Theresa was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap, the slight creak of his leather vest as he breathed, the calloused hands resting on his knees. "How are you finding life at Circle C?" he asked finally. Theresa smiled. "I'm happier than I've been in a very long time." He glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. "I'm glad to hear it." "Mr. Finley," she began, then stopped, gathering her courage. "Garrett, may I ask you something?" His eyebrows rose slightly at her use of his given name, but he nodded. "Of course. That day in town when Edgar—" She paused. "Why did you intervene? Many men would have looked the other way." Garrett was quiet for so long that Theresa thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "During the war, I saw too many people suffering while others stood by and did nothing." His gaze remained fixed on the darkening horizon. "I promised myself I wouldn't be one of the bystanders, not if I could help." He turned to look at her directly. "When I saw him strike you, saw the fear in your eyes and the way no one else moved to help, I couldn't walk away." The simple honesty of his answer moved Theresa deeply. "You could have been hurt." Edgar was known for his temper. Garrett's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I've faced worse odds." "Still," she insisted, "you put yourself at risk for a stranger. I never properly thanked you for that." "No thanks needed," he said quietly. "I'm only sorry I couldn't do more." Theresa thought of Edgar's death, of the life that had opened before her since then. "You did enough," she said softly. "More than you know." Their eyes held in the gathering twilight, something unspoken passing between them. Then Garrett cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting dark. I should let you return inside." Theresa rose as well, clutching the book to her chest. "Thank you for the book and the company." He tipped his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Bennett." "Theresa," she said impulsively. "Please call me Theresa." In the fading light, she saw his smile, warm, genuine, reaching his eyes. "Good night, Theresa." As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Theresa remained on the porch, her heart beating a little faster than usual. Something had shifted between them tonight, a step toward a future she was only beginning to imagine. Summer unfurled across the prairie, bringing scorching days and brief, violent thunderstorms that left the air smelling of ozone and wet earth. Life at Circle C settled into a rhythm that suited Theresa, perfectly busy enough to be fulfilling, structured enough to be comfortable, yet flexible enough to allow for moments of genuine pleasure. Her friendship with Emily deepened into something like the relationship she'd had with her mother, mentorship blended with genuine affection. James treated her with the gruff kindness he showed to all under his protection. And Garrett became a steadfast presence in her daily life. Their encounters grew more frequent, morning greetings as he rode out with the other hands, shared meals at the main house when James invited the foreman and senior cowboys to dinner, occasional exchanges of books and discussions of their contents. Each interaction was proper, observed by others, nothing that could raise eyebrows or spark gossip. Yet Theresa found herself looking forward to these moments, savoring the quiet conversations and shared observations. She learned that Garrett had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, that he wrote letters to his younger sister in Pennsylvania every month, that he could recite long passages of Tennyson from memory. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her dreams of someday seeing the ocean, her growing interest in botany sparked by working in Emily's garden. He listened with genuine interest, offering thoughtful responses that showed he valued her opinions and ideas. July brought the county fair to Willow Creek, and the entire ranch prepared to attend. James would be showing prize bulls, ranch hands would participate in riding competitions, and Emily had entries in the preserves and needlework categories. Theresa, who had continued her millinery work in her spare time, had crafted a hat that Emily insisted she enter in the handiworks division. The morning of the fair dawned clear and hot. Theresa dressed with special care in a light blue dress that Emily had helped her alter from one of her own, adding white trim and a sash that complemented her copper hair. She pinned her creation, a straw hat adorned with blue ribbons and silk wildflowers, carefully to her head, and surveyed her reflection with satisfaction. For the first time since Edgar's death, she had removed her black armband. The 6 months of mourning expected of a widow had passed, and while propriety still demanded modest behavior, she was no longer required to dress in full mourning attire. "You look lovely, dear," Emily said when Theresa joined her on the porch. "That color suits you perfectly." They traveled to town in the Carsons' wagon, Theresa seated between Emily and James on the bench, the ranch hands following on horseback. As they approached Willow Creek, Theresa felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of facing the townsfolk again. The fairgrounds had been set up in a field at the edge of town, with colorful banners, makeshift stalls, and a temporary corral for the riding competitions. Already the area was crowded with families from town and surrounding ranches and farms. Theresa was conscious of curious glances as they arrived, but with Emily by her side, she held her head high. After helping Emily arrange her entries in the pavilion and placing her own hat for judging, Theresa found herself with a few hours to enjoy the festivities. "You should see the riding competitions," Emily suggested. "James says Garrett is entering the bronco busting. He's quite skilled, apparently." Theresa tried to ignore the knowing look in Emily's eyes. "That sounds interesting. I've never watched bronco busting before." "Go on, then." "I'll be tied up with the ladies' auxiliary luncheon for a while anyway." The corral was surrounded by spectators when Theresa arrived. Men clustered close to the fence, while women and children watched from benches set farther back. Theresa found a spot where she could see clearly, settling beside a farm wife she recognized vaguely from church services in town. The woman gave her a curious look. "Mrs. Bennett, isn't it? Heard you'd gone to work out at Circle C." "Yes, that's right," Theresa replied politely, bracing for disapproval. To her surprise, the woman simply nodded. "Smart move. Town's no place for a young widow with no family, too many vultures circling." She introduced herself as Martha Givens from a homestead north of town. Their conversation was interrupted by cheers as the bronco busting competition began. Theresa watched with fascination as rider after rider attempted to stay aboard wildly bucking horses. Some were thrown almost immediately. Others managed to stay mounted for the required time, earning applause from the crowd. When Garrett's name was called, Theresa found herself holding her breath. He approached the chute with the calm deliberation that characterized all his movements, checking the saddle, speaking quietly to the handlers. When the gate opened, the horse exploded into the arena, twisting and bucking furiously. Garrett rode with a fluid grace that made the violent motion appear almost choreographed. His body moved in perfect counterbalance to the horse's attempts to dislodge him, one hand raised high, the other gripping the saddle. 8 seconds stretched into what seemed like an eternity to Theresa before the timekeeper's horn sounded, and Garrett smoothly dismounted as other cowboys moved in to control the still bucking horse. The crowd erupted in cheers. Even Mrs. Givens clapped enthusiastically. "That's some riding," she commented. "Your Mr. Finley knows his business." "He's not my Mr. Finley," Theresa protested automatically, though her cheeks warmed at the implication. Mrs. Givens gave her a knowing look. "If you say so, dear." The remaining competitors couldn't match Garrett's performance, and when the judges announced him as the winner, Theresa found herself clapping as enthusiastically as anyone in the crowd. When he glanced in her direction and tipped his hat, her heart performed a curious little somersault in her chest. The rest of the day passed in a pleasant blur. Theresa wandered through the exhibits, sampling treats from food stalls and exchanging polite greetings with townspeople. To her relief, most seemed to have lost interest in her circumstances, their curiosity replaced by new gossip or simply acceptance of her changed status. Late in the afternoon, as Theresa was admiring a display of quilts, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Congratulations are in order, I believe." She turned to find Garrett standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. His face was still flushed from the riding competition, hair damp at the temples. "For what?" she asked, puzzled. "Your hat won first prize in the millinery category." He nodded toward the handiworks pavilion. "They just posted the results." "Oh," delight bubbled through her. "How wonderful! I thought you might like to know." He shifted slightly, seeming almost shy. "I saw your work, it's very fine." "Thank you," she smiled up at him. "And congratulations to you as well. Your riding was impressive." A hint of color that had nothing to do with exertion touched his cheekbones. "Kind of you to say." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Garrett cleared his throat. "I was heading to get some lemonade. Would you care to join me?" The invitation was innocent enough dozens of people milled around them, making this a perfectly proper social interaction, yet Theresa felt a flutter of excitement at this deliberate seeking of her company. "I'd like that very much," she said. They strolled toward the refreshment stand, maintaining a proper distance between them. Garrett purchased 2 cups of lemonade, handling one to Theresa with careful courtesy. "How are you finding the fair?" he asked as they moved away from the crowded stand. "It's lovely," Theresa replied honestly, "though strange to be back in town after these months away." Garrett nodded in understanding. "Different seeing it as a visitor rather than a resident." "Exactly." She sipped her lemonade, appreciating its tart sweetness. "I've realized today that I don't miss living here at all." "The ranch suits you," he observed. "You seem happier there." "I am." She met his gaze directly. "I've found a freedom I never expected to have again." Something in his eyes softened. "I'm glad." As they walked through the fairgrounds, their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic, the quality of the exhibits, the upcoming cattle drive James was planning, books they had both read recently. Theresa was acutely conscious of the sidelong glances from townsfolk, but found she didn't care about their speculation. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when Emily found them, her face alight with excitement. "Theresa, there you are. Did you hear about your hat? First prize." She embraced Theresa warmly. "And Garrett, James says your riding was the talk of the fair. Well done, both of you." She linked her arm through Theresa's, giving Garrett a smile that held a hint of mischief. "I hope you've been keeping our Theresa entertained, Garrett." "She deserves some enjoyment after all her hard work." "I've been trying, madam," he replied with quiet dignity, "though I suspect my conversation isn't as interesting as the fair itself." Nonsense, Theresa said before she could stop herself. I've enjoyed our conversation very much. The smile that crossed his face at her words was worth any potential impropriety in the statement. Emily looked between them, satisfaction evident in her expression. Well, we should be heading back soon. James is settling up with the stockyard for the bull he sold. Garrett, will you be riding back with the other hands? Yes, madam. Mr. Carson asked me to make sure everyone gets back safely, especially those who might have visited the beer tent too enthusiastically. Emily nodded approvingly. Always dependable. We'll see you back at the ranch then. As Emily led Theresa away toward the wagon, Theresa glanced back over her shoulder. Garrett still stood where they'd left him, watching her go. When their eyes met, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt like a promise. The ride back to Circle C was filled with excited chatter about the day's events, but Theresa found her thoughts continually returning to those quiet moments with Garrett, the warmth in his eyes when he'd congratulated her, the careful way he'd handed her the lemonade, the genuine interest with which he'd listened to her opinions. For the first time since Edgar's death, perhaps for the first time in her life, Theresa allowed herself to acknowledge the possibility of a different kind of future, one that included not just independence, but companionship. Love, even. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. August brought the cattle drive, with James and most of the hands departing for 2 weeks to deliver a herd to the railroad at Cheyenne. The ranch seemed strangely quiet, with only Cook, Emily, Theresa, and a few older hands remaining to tend to daily operations. Theresa missed Garrett's presence more than she had expected. Their interactions had grown more frequent since the fair, though always within the bounds of propriety. Sometimes she would look up from her work to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. Other times, they would happen to walk the same path between house and barn, sharing observations about the weather or ranch business in voices that seemed to hold deeper meanings than the words themselves. Nothing had been declared, no intention stated, yet Theresa felt the subtle shift in their relationship, a current of possibility running beneath the surface of their everyday interactions. 10 days into the cattle drive, a late summer storm rolled across the prairie, bringing wind and driving rain that forced everyone to remain indoors. Theresa sat at the kitchen table with Emily, mending linens and listening to the rain lash against the windows. I always worry when they're on the trail during storms, Emily confessed, pausing in her work, though James is experienced enough to find safe shelter. Theresa nodded, trying not to reveal that her own thoughts had been following a similar path, centered specifically on Garrett's well-being. Emily's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely successful. He'll be fine, you know. Garrett's one of the most capable men James has ever hired. Theresa felt her cheeks warm. I'm sure all the men will return safely, she said diplomatically. Emily set down her mending with a sigh. Theresa, dear, may I speak plainly? Of course. I've watched you and Garrett these past months. Emily's expression was kind but serious. The way you look at each other when you think no one notices. The care you take to maintain propriety while seeking each other's company. Theresa's embarrassment deepened. Mrs. Carson, I assure you, Emily, please. She reached across to pat Theresa's hand. I'm not scolding you, quite the opposite. I think it's wonderful. Theresa stared at her, surprised. You do? Of course I do. Emily smiled warmly. Garrett is a good man who's been alone too long, and you deserve happiness after what you endured with Edgar. Theresa looked down at the pillowcase in her lap, its neat stitches blurring slightly. Nothing has been said between us, she admitted quietly, and I'm not sure anything will be. Garrett is very proper. He respects you, Emily corrected gently, and he's careful of your reputation, but I've seen the way he watches you when you're working in the garden or reading on the porch. That's not mere propriety, my dear." Hope fluttered in Theresa's chest. "Even if that's true, I'm not certain I'm ready. After Edgar." "Only you can know when your heart is ready," Emily said. "But don't let fear keep you from happiness when it's offered. Life is too short for such caution." They returned to their mending, but Emily's words lingered in Theresa's mind long after the storm had passed, and the prairie lay washed clean beneath a star-filled sky. The cattle drive returned 3 days later, the men tired and dusty but pleased with the successful delivery and the prices James had negotiated. Theresa was in the kitchen garden when they rode in, harvesting late summer vegetables for Cook's dinner preparations. She straightened at the sound of hoofbeats, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. James rode at the head of the column, with Garrett and the other hands strung out behind him. Relief washed through her at the sight of them all returning safely, though she tried to tell herself her racing heart was simply due to the general excitement of their arrival. As the men dismounted and began the process of caring for their horses, Theresa returned to her harvesting, stealing occasional glances toward the corral. She saw Garrett hand his reins to one of the younger hands, exchange words with James, and then, to her surprise, start walking toward the garden. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing hair flattened by sweat and trail dust. His face was tanned darker than before, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw. Despite the obvious weariness in his posture, his eyes brightened when they met hers. "Mrs. Bennett," he greeted her formally, though something in his voice belied the formality. "I trust you've been well during our absence." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Finley." She set her basket on the ground, suddenly conscious of her work apron and disheveled hair. "The drive was successful," he nodded. "Mr. Carson got good prices, no major troubles along the way." A small smile touched his lips, though I confess the accommodations left much to be desired. Theresa returned his smile, enjoying this glimpse of humor. "I imagine sleeping under the stars has its drawbacks, especially during rainstorms," he agreed. Then more seriously, "I thought about all of you at the ranch during that big storm. Hoped you weren't worried." The simple admission warmed her. "We were concerned for everyone's safety," she said carefully, then added more softly, "I'm glad you've returned unharmed." Something in his expression shifted, a subtle intensity entering his gaze. "Theresa, Garrett," James's voice called from the direction of the barn, "need you to look at Thompson's horse. Something's not right with its foreleg." Garrett closed his eyes briefly in resignation, then opened them with a rueful smile. "Duty calls. But perhaps we might continue this conversation later." "I'd like that," Theresa said, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded, replaced his hat, and with one last lingering look, turned back toward the barn. Theresa watched him go, her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm of anticipation and hope. The opportunity for their conversation didn't materialize that evening. James requested Garrett's presence at dinner to discuss the drive and future plans for the herd, keeping the discussion focused on ranch business. Though Garrett sat across from Theresa at the table, their interaction was limited to passing dishes and exchanged pleasantries. The following day brought a flurry of activity as the ranch returned to normal operations after the drive. Theresa was kept busy helping Emily update accounts with the proceeds from the cattle sale, leaving little time for personal matters. By evening, Theresa found herself increasingly distracted, wondering if Garrett had changed his mind about their conversation. She retreated to the back porch after dinner, seeking solitude to sort through her thoughts. The evening was pleasantly cool after a warm day, with a crescent moon rising over the eastern horizon. She had been sitting alone for perhaps 15 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Garrett's tall figure emerging from the shadows, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Theresa," he said softly, "may I join you?" Her pulse quickened at his use of her given name. "Please do." He settled beside her on the porch bench, leaving a proper distance between them. For a moment neither spoke, the night sounds of the prairie filling the silence, crickets chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, an owl's soft hoot from the cottonwoods near the creek. "I've been thinking about what I wanted to say to you yesterday," Garrett finally began, his voice low. Trying to find the right words, Theresa clasped her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "And have you found them?" He turned slightly to face her, his features becoming clearer in the soft moonlight. "Maybe not the perfect words, but honest ones." She nodded encouragement, not trusting her voice. "When I first saw you in town that day," he continued, "with your husband." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I knew I had to intervene, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because something about you called to me. Your dignity, even in that moment. Your courage." Theresa's breath caught in her throat. "When circumstances brought you here to the ranch, I told myself to maintain distance. You were newly widowed, finding your way. The last thing you needed was another man presuming upon your situation." His hands rested on his knees, the knuckles white with tension. "But these months working alongside you, seeing your strength and kindness, your intelligence, my feelings have grown into something I can no longer ignore." He met her gaze directly. "I care for you, Theresa, deeply, more than I thought possible after the war left me so hollow. You've brought light back into my world." Tears pricked at Theresa's eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming emotion his words evoked. "Garrett," he held up a hand gently. "Please, let me finish. I need you to understand that I expect nothing. If you don't share my feelings or if you're not ready, I'll respect that completely. Our working relationship won't change. I needed you to know." The vulnerability in his expression, the careful way he offered his heart while giving her complete freedom to refuse it, moved Theresa profoundly. Without conscious thought, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. "I do share them," she said softly. "These feelings have grown in me too, so gradually I hardly noticed until they were too strong to deny." The hope that dawned in his eyes was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. "Truly," she nodded, her own smile tremulous. "When Edgar died, I thought my chance for happiness had died with him, not because I loved him at the end, but because I believed I was too broken, too damaged by what he'd done to me." "You were never broken," Garrett said with quiet conviction. "Wounded, perhaps, but never broken." "I see that now." She squeezed his hand gently. "Because of you, in part, you saw me as whole and capable when others saw only a victim or an object of pity." Garrett turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through Theresa's body. "I want to court you properly," he said. "With the Carsons' knowledge and blessing, no secrets, no cause for gossip or scandal." "I would like that very much," Theresa replied, her heart full. They sat together in the moonlight, hands joined, the promise of a future stretching before them like the vast prairie under an endless sky. The courtship that followed was conducted with careful propriety under the approving eyes of James and Emily Carson. Garrett would join Theresa for walks around the ranch property after Sunday dinners, always within sight of the main house. They exchanged books and letters, shared conversations on the porch in the evenings, and gradually built a relationship founded on mutual respect and deepening affection. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn color to the cottonwoods along the creek. On a particularly fine Sunday afternoon, Garrett asked Theresa if she would accompany him to see a special place on the ranch property. "It's about a mile ride," he explained. "I've already asked Mrs. Carson to chaperone, if you're agreeable." Theresa, who had been taking riding lessons from Emily, nodded eagerly. "I'd love to." Emily rode with them, maintaining a discreet distance that allowed conversation while preserving propriety. Garrett led them along the creek, following its winding path through stands of cottonwood and willow, until they reached a small, sheltered meadow nestled against a low bluff. Wildflowers still bloomed here despite the advancing season, purple asters and golden sunflowers nodding in the gentle breeze. A natural spring bubbled from the base of the bluff, feeding into the creek and creating a peaceful, gurgling soundtrack. "It's beautiful," Theresa breathed as Garrett helped her dismount. "I found it during my first week at Circle C," he said, keeping his voice low as Emily busied herself with something in her saddlebag, giving them a moment of relative privacy. "Reminded me of a spot near my home in Pennsylvania. Somewhere peaceful." Theresa turned slowly, taking in the sheltered beauty of the place. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Garrett's expression was solemn. "Theresa, I brought you here because—" He took a deep breath. "Because I wanted to ask you something important in a place that matters to me." Her heart began to race as she realized his intention. "Garrett," he took her hands in his eyes never leaving hers. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. Getting to know you, watching you blossom into the strong, independent woman you are, it's been a privilege." Theresa felt tears gathering in her eyes as Garrett continued. "I love you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you, a good life, based on respect and partnership and joy." He squeezed her hands gently. "Theresa Bennett, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Theresa couldn't speak past the emotion tightening her throat. All the pain and fear of her past seemed to fall away, leaving only this moment, this man, this choice that was truly hers to make. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Garrett Finley, I would be proud to be your wife." The smile that illuminated his face was like nothing she had ever seen, pure joy without reservation. From a respectful distance, Emily clapped her hands in delight. "I knew it," she called. "James owes me $1. He said you'd wait until October at least." Theresa laughed through her tears as Garrett shook his head ruefully. "Should have known they'd have a wager on us." "I don't mind," Theresa said, still holding his hands. "They've been hoping for this almost as much as I have." Garrett raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart sing. "I promised you once that you wouldn't suffer pain again," he said softly. "I intend to keep that promise for all our days together." "I know you will," Theresa replied. "And I promise to bring you the same joy and peace you've brought me." They married on the first Sunday in October, with the prairie autumn at its peak of golden glory. The ceremony was held at the Carson Ranch, with James giving the bride away and Emily serving as matron of honor. The ranch hands cleaned up impressively for the occasion, and even Mrs. Abernathy made the journey from Willow Creek, bringing several of the townspeople who had been kind to Theresa. Theresa wore a simple cream dress that Emily had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her copper hair was arranged in soft curls beneath a small hat of her own design, adorned with cream ribbons and tiny dried wildflowers from the meadow where Garrett had proposed. Garrett, nearly unrecognizable in a new black suit, watched her walk toward him with such naked adoration that several of the female guests dabbed at their eyes. The Methodist minister from Willow Creek performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett's kiss was gentle but filled with promise. The celebration afterward was joyous, with plenty of food, music from a fiddler among the hands, and dancing that continued well into the evening. When the newlyweds finally departed in a buggy decorated with ribbons and flowers by the ranch hands, cheers and good wishes followed them down the lane. They traveled not to Willow Creek, but to a small homestead on the edge of Carson property that James had offered as a wedding gift, a cozy 2-room cabin with a barn and corral, situated near enough to the main ranch for Garrett to continue his work while giving the couple privacy to begin their life together. As Garrett carried Theresa across the threshold in the traditional manner, they both knew that this was not just the beginning of their marriage, but the continuation of a partnership that had begun that day on a dusty street in Willow Creek, when a cowboy had taken a woman's hand and promised her no more pain. 5 years later, Theresa Finley stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Garrett taught their 3-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their infant daughter, Emily, slept peacefully in the cradle Garrett had carved during the long winter evenings. The homestead had prospered under their joint care. What had begun as a small cabin was now a comfortable 4-room house. The original barn had been expanded, and a vegetable garden twice the size of Emily Carson's flourished under Theresa's careful tending. Garrett had risen to foreman at Circle C, while Theresa had developed a small but successful millinery business, creating hats that were sought after by women from surrounding ranches and even Cheyenne. As she watched her husband's patient instruction and their son's delighted giggles, Theresa reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of her first marriage had faded to a distant memory, overshadowed by the joy and security of her life with Garrett. He had kept his promise not just to shield her from physical harm, but to create a life where she could flourish as an equal partner. Her talents and opinions valued, her independence respected. When Garrett looked up and caught her watching, his smile still had the power to quicken her pulse. He lifted little James from the pony and set him on his shoulders, walking toward the house. "Mama, did you see?" James called excitedly. "I ride like Papa." "I saw, sweetheart," Theresa replied, her heart full. "You're very brave." As Garrett climbed the porch steps, he leaned in to kiss her, a casual gesture of affection that never failed to remind her how fortunate she was. "Happy?" he asked quietly, shifting James to one arm so he could touch her cheek gently. Theresa leaned into his touch, thinking of all they had built together, all they had yet to share. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she answered truthfully. The promise made on a dusty street in Willow Creek had been kept and transformed into something far richer than either of them could have imagined on that fateful day when a cowboy had taken a frightened woman's hand and changed both their lives forever.